He constituted it, but not the end of a new emergent culture. What happened to religions? Well, something pretty significant. Beings who had a powerful impact on others, Lao Tzu, Confucius, Jesus, Buddha, Moses, you name it, Muhammad, were transformed into textual beings. In other words, they were flesh and blood beings, but they died and were transformed into text. And it is the interaction with the written text that enabled people to internalize a new concept of God and relationship to it. And I want to beat this to death. We could talk about it for an hour, but the printing press did the same thing. Lutheranism, Protestantism, and its 1,000,001 dicings and slicings of what had been a monolithic structure, more or less, was enabled by the printing press, which transformed Luther into a textual being. And I'm making the point that electronic communication, in all of its forms, are redefining images of God and religious structures as well. So that it's no accident that all of the religions that people habitually, without thinking about it, think of as religions, all came into being and then have really much stopped coming into being in that very narrow bandwidth of historical time, which coincided with a few thousand years, which was characterized by the emergence of writing and the transformation of human consciousness which it occasioned. And therefore I'm saying, absolutely. The technology frames and shapes you in a way that you can't know until you do. And then when you see it, it's like the Terminator on the moon. You look at the moon through a telescope, you see light and dark, and you see the mountains where the line of light hits the line of dark. You can't see it. Over here it's all washed out in light, over here it's all dark. But at the Terminator, which is what it is to be gifted with living in a transitional time if you can stand it, is that you, as you are recontextualized, you are creatively reorganized yourself as a possibility for the future. And that's what the definition of human identity is. So when you get, yes?
Just to sort of briefly expand on what you're saying about written word being important in religion, if you look at what Heraclitus wrote and you look at what John wrote, they're both literally calling word God. And
right.
Have a direct correlation of the word is God.
Right. And someone who in the 16 or 1700s was enabled by Luther to walk into, like the churches I served, Episcopal, and take a book and read silently to oneself, was not aware that that was a transforming event. But today, when you tell people you don't need to have a book, we can have it on a screen. I remember when I first started writing that as suggestions, to have a screen, no books, just plug it in. I saw a monitor in every pew, like on an airline seat, but you walk into a lot of churches these days and you just have a huge projection monitor and they just plug in the program for the Sunday. And people are being changed by the kind of, quote, worship, unquote, that is collective experience they have in relationship to that technology, and therefore their ideas about themselves. And so it's ironic that fundamentalism, literalism in a Protestant context, thinks it is going back to the original text, but it was literally unthinkable until the 1900s in the form in which it has come to bedevil us. Okay? So anyway, short answer is yeah, absolutely. 10 minutes to go? Oh boy. Okay, security. Identity is a function of boundaries. We've talked about that. The boundaries are morphing. The boundaries are changing. We like to talk about the insider threat these days being one of the biggest threats, but how do you define an insider if the boundaries themselves are like a Mobius strip? What is it you're trying to defend? You can try to defend the perimeter, but anybody with any sense has given that up as a singular task. We'll be in a truly dangerous stance, said my friend Brian Snow. We will think we are secure and act accordingly when in fact we are not secure. In other words, we are okay, we have a firewall, no need to worry about internal authentication and authorization models, except for the 65 exceptions in our firewall rule set. That's the real problem, he said, with the perimeter model. It has potentially ugly failure modes because once you're beyond perimeter protection, you are owned. You are owned indeed. And what he says with great poignancy is a senior guy at NSA, very wonderful, wise guy, is that actionable intelligence saves lives. And we had developed, he said, at NSA, a definition of true and beautiful, which was based on the coherence of the algorithm, its efficiency, its pristine mathematical beauty, and that didn't save lives. And when you hold people, as I have in the intelligence community, who are sobbing because they did not think that many people needed to die on a particular mission and it was their responsibility, then you cannot, as Brian says, do this work unless you see the face of evil. You cannot do this work unless you have seen the face of evil in a visceral kind of way, and it confronts you with, I am not that. I am opposed to that. But, let's go back to the religious thing briefly. The notion of who is the enemy. Who is the enemy? When you are doing security, you're trying to protect and defend, and you're trying to oppose the enemy. But who is the enemy? Up until the time of Christendom, the enemy was defined pretty much universally as a member of the other tribe, the other, them. And then it was redefined in Christendom as that in myself, which frustrates and gets in the way. Pogo didn't say the enemy is us. Jesus did. And a lot of other people, contemporaneous, like Rabbi Hillel, with Jesus at the time, saw that the enemy was that in us which frustrates the coherence of the system. And there is no other. Because human consciousness, in part through writing and other emergent structures, was distributing itself in a new self-conception, a new way. And the enemy was no longer defined as the other. And yet, if you look at most of the models of computer security, you are trying to screen someone out, and you are trying to hold someone in. You still can't shake the notion that there's a perimeter around something. And yet what has happened in the information state is that boundaries are now functional. Example is ports. We say we can't have things coming in container ships that might be explosive. So we have to stop them at the port of origin. What does that mean? It means the boundaries of the United States are no longer geographically defined. And that throws us back to, well, where did geographical boundaries come from? Well, you just look back historically at 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and you see the emergence of a boundary around what we call a nation state as that level of organizational structure appropriate to the complexity, political, economic, and social, of emergent civilized structures. And therefore, the boundaries of larger nation states, the complexity, and the way of organizing themselves in relationship to each other found itself so that you believe you are citizens of countries, because we have been trained to believe a primary function of our identity is a citizen of a country. And yet, who are we opposed to? Who are we opposed to? We have defined, let me quote myself, because I like me, and periodically I say something worth saying. If I can find it. Well, I've done that too, but the way I talk, no one knows that I'm doing that. Okay. In the U.S. intelligence community, mission and charter of the intelligence community sanctions breaking foreign laws, right, while prohibiting similar activities in American soil. But because of the technologies, distinctions of foreign and domestic no longer hold. The convergence of enabling technologies of intrusion, interception, and panoptic reach, combined with a sense of urgency about a counter-terror imperative, and a mandate from our leaders to do everything possible to defeat an amorphous, non-state entity who is defined by terroristic behaviors rather than by boundaries, borders, or even a clear ideological allegiance, has created an ominous but invisible set of conditions that undermine the cornerstones of law, ethics, human identity, and even religious traditions. In other words, there is a challenge because of the technologies themselves to our fundamental definitions of who we are and who we are defending. And I have lots of examples which I don't have time to give, but people often wait when I'm talking to organizational structures where they adhere. I'll give you a quick example. This is a guy who was sent to Haiti with Army counterintelligence. He was very gung-ho and very much believing in the mission. And the mission was to interdict and shut down some avenues that cartels were using to move cocaine and other drugs through Haiti into the United States. And shortly after he arrived, there was a regime change or some political chaos down in common in Haiti. And he became very anxious about whether they would be able to do what they went there to do. And then he heard that someone was coming down, actually someone from Arkansas as it happened, who was close to someone else from Arkansas. And he felt relieved because he thought what was going to happen was that the mission was going to be shorn up. And yet what the person did primarily was make sure the route stayed open, because it was important.